Plane consciousness. If we imagine an immobile circle upon a plane, then for the two-dimensional being it will appear as a moving line, with some very strange and, to him, inconceivable motions. The two-dimensional being will never see that motion. Perhaps he would even define it as molecular motion, i.e., movement of the minutest invisible particles of matter. Furthermore, a circle rotating around an axis passing through its center, for the two-dimensional being, will differ in some inconceivable way from an ordinary immobile circle. Both will appear to be moving, but moving differently. For the two-dimensional being, a circle or a square rotating around its center, on account of its double motion, would be an inexplicable phenomenon. Like the phenomenon of life, for the modern physicist. Therefore, for the two-dimensional being, a straight line will represent immobile matter, a broken or a curved line, matter in motion, and a moving line, living matter. The center of a circle or a square would be inaccessible to the plane being, just as the center of a cube or a sphere, made of solid matter, is inaccessible to us. For the two-dimensional being, even the idea of a center will be incomprehensible, since they possess no idea of a center. Having no idea of phenomena proceeding outside of the surface, that is, outside of his space, the plane being would think of all phenomena as proceeding on his plane, and all phenomena that he regards as proceeding on his plane, he will consider as being in causal interdependence, one with another. That is, he would think that one phenomenon is the effect of another, which has happened right there, and the cause of a third, which will happen again on the same plane. If a multicolored cube passes through the plane, then the plane being would perceive the entire cube and its motion, simply as a change in color of lines lying in the plane. Thus, if a blue line replaces a red one, then the plane being will regard the red line as a past event. He will not be in a position to realize the idea that the red line still exists somewhere. He will say that the line is single, and that it becomes blue as a result of certain causes of a physical nature. If the cube moves backward, so that the red line appears again after the blue one, then for the two-dimensional being this will constitute a new phenomenon. He will say that the line became red again. For the being living on a plane, everything above and below, if the plane be horizontal, and on the left or the right, if the plane be vertical, will be existing in time, in the past and in the future. That which in reality is located outside the plane, will be regarded as something non-existent. As that which is already past, i.e. as something which has disappeared, ceased to be, and will never return. Or as being in the future, i.e. as not existent, not manifested, and as a thing in potentiality. We can imagine a wheel, with spokes painted different colors, rotating through the surface upon which the plane being lives. To such a being, all the motion of the wheel will appear simply as a color variation in the line of intersection, between the wheel and the plane. The plane being will call this variation in the color of the line a phenomenon, and observing these phenomena, he will notice in them a certain succession. He will know that the yellow line is followed by the blue one, the blue by the red by the purple, and so on. If simultaneous with the appearance of the yellow line, some phenomenon occurs, say the ringing of a bell, then the two-dimensional being will say that the yellow line is the cause of that ringing. The change in the color of the lines, in the opinion of the two-dimensional being, will depend upon causes lying right on his plane. Any presupposition of the existence of causes lying outside of the plane will be characterized as fantastic and entirely unscientific. It will seem so to him, because he will never be in a position to represent the wheel to himself, i.e. the parts of the wheel on either side of the plane. After a rough study of the color of the lines, and knowing the order of their sequence, the plane being, perceiving one of them, say the blue one, will think that the red and the purple lines have already passed, i.e. disappeared and ceased to exist, gone into the past. Then, that those lines which have not as yet appeared, i.e. the yellow one and the new purple one still to follow, do not yet exist, but lie in the future. Therefore, though not conceiving the form of the universe, and regarding it as infinite in all directions, the plane being will nevertheless involuntarily think of the past as being situated somewhere at one side of all, and of the future as somewhere at the other side of this totality. In such a manner, will the plane being conceive the idea of time. We see that this idea arises, because the two-dimensional being senses only 2 out of 3 dimensions of space. The third dimension, he senses only after its effects become manifest upon the plane, and therefore he regards it as something different from the first two dimensions of space, calling it time. Now imagine that through the plane upon which the two-dimensional being lives, two wheels with multicolored spokes are rotating in opposite directions. The spokes of one wheel come from above and go below, the spokes of the other wheel come from below and go above. The plane being will never notice the difference. He will never notice that where for one line which he sees, there lies the past, for another line there lies the future. This thought will never enter his mind, because he will conceive of the past and the future very confusedly, regarding them as concepts, and not as actual facts. However, at the same time he will be firmly convinced that the past goes in one direction and the future in another. Therefore it will seem to him wildly absurd that on one side something past and something future can lie together, and on the other side, and also aside from these two, something future and something past. To the plane being, the idea that some phenomena come whence others go and vice versa, will seem equally absurd. He will tenaciously think that the future is that from whence everything comes, and the past is that to where everything goes, from where nothing returns. He will be totally unable to understand that events may arise from the past, just as they do from the future. Thus, we see that the plane being will regard the changes in color of the lines lying on the plane very naively. The appearance of different spokes, he will regard as the change in color of one and the same line, then the repeated appearance of the same colored spoke, he will regard always as the new appearance of a given color. Nevertheless, having noticed periodicity in the change in color of the lines upon the surface, having noted and then remembered the order of their appearance, and having learned to define the timing of the appearance of certain spokes in relation to some other more constant phenomenon, the plane being will be in a position to foretell the change of the line, from one color to another. Thereupon he will say, that he has studied this phenomenon, that he can apply to it mathematical method, and can calculate it. If we ourselves enter this world of plane beings, then its inhabitants will sense the lines limiting the sections of our bodies. These sections will be for them living beings. They will not know from whence they appear, why they alter, or whither they disappear in such a miraculous manner. So too, the sections of all other inanimate but moving objects will seem to be independent living beings. If the consciousness of a plane being should suspect our existence, and thence come into some sort of communion with our consciousness, to him we would appear as higher, omniscient, possibly omnipotent, but above all, incomprehensible beings of a quite inconceivable category. We would see his world just as it is, and not as it seems to him. We could see the past and the future, could foretell direct and even create events. We could know the very substance of things. We could know what matter, the straight line is, and what motion, the broken line, the curve or the angle is. We could see an angle, and we could see a center. All of this would give us an enormous advantage over the two-dimensional being. In all the phenomena of the world of the two-dimensional being, we could see considerably more than he sees, or could see things that he would never see. We could tell him a great deal that was new, amazing and unexpected about the phenomena of his world, provided of course that he could hear and understand us. First of all, we could tell him that what he regards as phenomena, angles and curves, are simply properties of higher figures. That other phenomena of his world are not phenomena at all, but merely parts or sections of phenomena. That what he calls solids are only sections of solids, in many things besides. We would be able to tell him that on both sides of his plane, i.e. of his space or ether, lies infinite space, which the plane being calls time. That in this space lie the causes of all of his phenomena, and the phenomena themselves. The past, as well as future ones. Furthermore, we might add that phenomena themselves are not something happening and then ceasing to be, but combinations of properties of higher solids. We would nonetheless experience considerable difficulty in explaining anything to the plane being, and it would be difficult for him to understand us. It would be difficult primarily because he would not have the concepts corresponding to our concepts. He would lack the necessary words. For example, section, this would for him be a quite new and inconceivable word. Then angle, again, an inconceivable word. Center, still more inconceivable. The third perpendicular, something incomprehensible, lying outside of his geometry. The fallacy of his concept of time would be the most difficult thing for the plane being to understand. He could never understand that which has passed and that which is to be are existing simultaneously on the lines perpendicular to his plane. He could never conceive the idea that the past is identical with the future, because phenomena come from both sides and go in both directions. The most difficult thing, however, for the plane being, would be to conceive the idea that time includes in itself two ideas. The idea of space and the idea of motion upon that space. It has been shown already that what the two-dimensional being living on a plane calls motion is for us quite a different aspect. In his book, The Fourth Dimension, under the heading, The First Chapter in the History of Force-Space, Hinton writes, Parmenides and Asiatic thinkers, with whom he is in close affinity, propounded a theory of existence that is in accord with the concept of a possible relation between a higher and a lower dimensional space. It is one that in all ages has had a strange attraction for pure intellect, and is the natural mode of thought for those who refrain from projecting their own volition into nature under the guise of causality. According to Parmenides of the school of Elia, the all is one, unmoving and unchanging. The permanent amid the transient. That foothold for thought, that solid ground for feeling, upon the discovery of which depends all of our life, it is no phantom. It is the image, amidst the deception of true being, the eternal, the unmoved and the one. Thus says Parmenides. But how is it possible to explain the shifting scene, these mutations of things? Illusion, answers Parmenides. Distinguishing between truth and error, he tells the true doctrine of one, the false opinion of a changing world. He is no less memorable for that manner of his advocacy, than for the cause that he advocates. Can the mind conceive a more delightful intellectual picture than that of Parmenides pointing to the one, the true, the unchanging, and yet on the other hand ready to discuss all manner of false opinion? In support of the true opinion, he proceeded by the negative way, showing the self-contradictions in the ideas of change and motion. To express his doctrine in a ponderous modern form, we must make the statement that motion is phenomenal and not real. Let us therefore present his doctrine. Imagine a sheet of still water, into which a slanting stick is being lowered with a motion vertically downward. Let 1, 2 and 3 be three consecutive positions of the stick. A, B, and C will be three consecutive positions of the meeting of the stick with the surface of the water. As the stick passes down deeper into the water, the meeting point will move from A to B and then to C. Suppose now that all the water is to be removed except for a film, then at the meeting between the film and the stick, there will be an interruption of that film. If we suppose the film to have a property, like say that of a soap bubble, of closing up and around any penetrating object, then as the stick goes vertically downward, the interruption of the film will move on, in a linear manner. If we pass a spiral through the same film, then the intersection will give a point, moving in a circle. For the plane being such a point, moving in a circle on its plane, would probably constitute a cosmic phenomenon, something similar to the motion of a planet in its orbit. Suppose now, the spiral to remain still, and the film instead to move vertically upward, then the entire spiral would be represented in the film by the consecutive positions of the point of intersection. Then, if instead of one spiral, we could take a complicated construction consisting of several spirals, inclined and straight lines, broken and curved lines. Next, to pass these lines through a film of water, or the surface of a soap bubble. If the film were to move vertically upward slowly, then we would have represented an entire universe of moving points, the movement of which would appear to the plane being as original. The plane being will explain these movements as depending upon one another, never thinking that the movements are fictitious, dependent merely upon the spirals, and other lines lying outside of its space. Returning to the plane being and his perception of the world, then analyzing his relations to the three-dimensional world, we see that for the two-dimensional or plane being, it would be very difficult to understand all the complexity of the phenomenon of our world, as it appears to us. It would be accustomed to perceive the world as being too simple. taking into consideration the sections of figures, instead of the figures themselves. The plane being would compare them in relation to their length, and the greater or lesser curvature, i.e. for him, their more or less rapid motion. The differences between the objects of our world, as they exist for us, he would not understand. The function of the objects of our world would be completely mysterious to his mind, incomprehensible and even supernatural. Imagine now that a coin and a candle of equal dimension are on the surface upon which the two-dimensional being lies. To the plane being, they will appear as two equal circles, i.e. two moving and absolutely identical lines. He will never discover any difference between them. The functions of the coin and the candle in our world, these are for him absolutely terra incognita. If we were to imagine what enormous evolution the plane being would need to pass through in order to understand the functions of the coin and the candle, the difference between these functions, then we would understand the nature of the division between the plane world and the world of three dimensions. The complete impossibility of even imagining, on a plane, anything at all like the three-dimensional world, with its manifoldness of function. The properties of the phenomena of the plane world would be extremely monotonous. They will differ in their appearance, their duration and in their periodicity. Solids, and the things of this world will be flat and uniform as shadows, i.e. like the shadows of quite different solids, which seem to us uniform. Even if the plane being were to come into contact with our consciousness, he would never be in a position to understand the richness of the phenomena in our world, or the variety of function of things in his own world. Plane beings would not be in a position to master our most ordinary concepts. It would be extremely difficult for them to understand that phenomena that appear identical for them are in reality quite different. Then on the other hand, that phenomena quite separate for them are in reality parts of one great phenomenon, and even one object or one being. This last factor would be one of the most difficult things for the plane being to understand. If we imagine our plane being to be inhabiting a horizontal plane, intersecting the top of a tree and parallel to the surface of the earth, then for such a being each of the various sections of the branches would appear as quite separate phenomenon or objects. The idea of the tree and its branches will never occur to him. Generally speaking, the understanding of the most fundamental and simple things of our world would be infinitely long and difficult to the plane being. He would have to entirely reconstruct his concepts of space and time, which would be the first step. Unless this is done, then nothing would be accomplished. Until the plane being could imagine our entire universe as existing in time, i.e. until he refers to time everything lying on both sides of his surface, then he would never understand anything. In order to begin to understand the third dimension, the inhabitant of the plane must conceive of his time concept spatially, that is, to translate his time into space. To achieve even the spark of a true understanding of our world, he will have to completely reconstruct all of his ideas, to re-evaluate all of his values, to revise all of his concepts, to dissever the uniting concepts, to unite those that are dissevered, and what is most important, to create an infinite number of new ones. If we put down the 5 fingers of one hand onto the surface of the two-dimensional world, they will be for him 5 separate phenomena. Try to imagine what an enormous mental evolution it would require in order to understand that these 5 separate phenomena on his plane are the fingertips of the hand of a large, active and intelligent being, man. To map out step by step how the plane being would acquire an understanding of our world, lying in the region of to him, the mysterious third dimension, parts of which would be in the past, and parts in the future, would be interesting. To understand the world of 3 dimensions, he would first of all cease to be 2-dimensional, and become 3-dimensional himself, or in other words, he must sense an interest in the life of 3-dimensional space. Thereafter, having felt this interest, he would by doing so, transcend his plane, and never be in a position to return to it. Entering further and further within the circle of ideas and concepts that were entirely incomprehensible to him before, he will already become not 2-dimensional but 3-dimensional. All along essentially, The two-dimensional being will have been three-dimensional, that is, he will have had the third dimension, but without his being conscious of it himself. To become three-dimensional, he must be three-dimensional. Then as the end of ends, he can address himself to self-liberation from the illusion of two-dimensionality, embracing the apprehension of the third dimension.